The Seahawks offseason program is officially in the books. Didn't even have a practice today, as you can see with me doing the show from my car. What did we learn from the Seahawks offseason program on offense, defense, and special teams? We'll be taking a close look as we put a bow in the offseason on our Thursday edition of Locked On Seahawks.
You are Locked On Seahawks, your daily Seattle Seahawks podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Greetings, 12. This is Corbin Smith, host of the Locked On Seahawks podcast, your daily Seahawks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Glad to be joined, as always, by my co-host in crime, Rob Rang, and a special thanks to all the 12s that are listening in, whether you're down in Sacramento, California, in the land of the 49ers, or across the country in St. Petersburg, Florida. We appreciate each and every one of you for making Locked On Seahawks your first listen 5 days a week. The offseason is officially in the books, at least the spring program aspect of the offseason. The Seahawks are now truly in offseason mode for the next 6 weeks. We're going to be breaking down what we learned on offense, defense, and special teams over the past month and change in OTAs and an abbreviated mandatory minicamp. And we'll be taking a look at our biggest questions that we still have heading towards training camp. This episode is brought your way by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use the code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Now for your lead story here on our Thursday edition of Locked On Seahawks. They wrapped up their offseason program early in the Pacific Northwest. Mike Macdonald allowing the Seahawks to take an extra day off, skipping the final day of mandatory minicamp, which means the offseason spring program has officially come to a conclusion. And the next time we will see Mike Macdonald and his Seahawks, it'll be in late July when they report for training camp. And of course, Rob, these are abbreviated practices. Mike Macdonald called them passing camps yesterday. This is not necessarily real football. And yet at the same time, there's still a lot that you can learn from watching these practices, especially with a new coaching staff, a new head coach, a lot of new players, incoming rookies. There's plenty to glean from these practices. So we're going to be breaking down what we learned about the Seahawks during this offseason program. And we got to start on offense with this explosive scheme that Ryan Grubb is implementing here with all the returning weapons the Seahawks have. And I know one of those weapons in particular stood out to you throughout this offseason program.
Yeah, there's no question about it, Corbin. Jackson Smith-Njigba just feels like he is about to explode onto the NFL scene. That, to me, was one of the biggest takeaways here. Of course, the Seahawks selected him in the first round a year ago, and we saw him make some splashy plays. Obviously, he came up clutch with a couple of game winners and made some spectacular plays along the way, but I think that he is just scratching the surface, and everything that I was able to witness in person at the just concluded mini camp, and then conversations with some of the other folks, both in the media and with the Seahawks, the actual club itself, indicate that again, the JSN is his star is on the rise, and that the Seahawks are excited about it.
Yeah, he has really been the MVP of the offseason program. And I know Super Bowls are not won in May and June, but when you're talking young players, these are still incredibly critical, especially when you're bringing in a new offense like this. And Jackson Smith-Njigba, like everybody else, has had to learn that. I want to go to the veteran side of things, though, because I think going into this offseason program, we know this from our listeners. Guys, we read the comments, and this has been something that even nationally, there's plenty of people out there that think the Seahawks should have had a quarterback competition. Our friend Jim Nagy even opined that, hey, let's let Sam Howell compete with Geno Smith. But if there was a lesson that really jumped out to me over the last 4 or 5 weeks, this is Geno Smith's football team. There's no question about it. It isn't just the fact that yesterday's practice, Sam Howell, the worst I've seen him look in a Seahawks uniform to this point. Bad practices happen. We've seen Geno Smith throw a bunch of interceptions at a practice before. It happens. But Geno Smith just is in complete command of this offense. His quick release is a beauty to behold. All these receivers coming back, the continuity they've got there, his skill set fits what Ryan Grubb wants to do so well. Even if they would have opened up the competition, there wouldn't be one right now because Sam Howell has not been able to show enough to even suggest that there should be a competition there. That's not to say he can't be a starter for the Seahawks down the road. I still am high on his potential, but this is Geno Smith's football team, at least in 2024, if not longer. If he plays really well in this offense, I could see him being the starter for several more seasons. This is a big year for him, but there's no question that this is Geno Smith's football team. Everybody is following his lead. He's taken another step forward in that department, and he really seems to be grasping this new offense beautifully. So I am looking forward to seeing what this looks like when the real bullets start flying in late July, early August at the quarterback position. But this is Geno Smith's spot. He is the team leader.
Yeah, and that's what the Seahawks have said from the jump, is that this was going to be Geno Smith is going to be their starter. They brought in Sam Howell. So I'm not necessarily surprised by that, but I would echo your sentiments, Corbin. Everything I've seen from Geno Smith is that he has been continued to be the most accurate quarterback. And so if it was close, then I think that you could have an argument that maybe that Sam Howell might be able to push Geno Smith a little bit. But it really has been Geno Smith has just been more accurate, more decisive with the football, just more impressive overall. And so I would agree with that. Now, the one caveat that I would kind of throw in there is, again, you're talking about an aging quarterback. And if Seattle's offensive line is not up to the task of protecting Geno Smith, then maybe you are going to see Sam Howell onto the field. And so that's where I want to kind of focus my next comment here. As far as something that I learned, I was really concerned about the depth at the guard position specifically. And I think that the signing of the veteran Laken Tomlinson was a huge deal. Certainly the signing, or the drafting of Christian Haynes as well. But I think that the guard depth has been better than at least that I expected. Been very intrigued by McClendon and Curtis. We talked about him a lot in yesterday's show. And then, of course, Anthony Bradford as the incumbent starter at that right guard position as well. He returned on day 2 of that just concluded minicamp. And so because of that fact, Corbin, I really believe that the depth at guard is actually better than I thought that it would be. And that, to me, again, is a great reason for optimism moving forward.
And I'm going to piggyback off that with one player in particular. We've talked so much about the defensive free agent signings, Rayshawn Jenkins, the 2 linebackers who we've yet to see because of injuries. The best free agent signing that this team made could very well be playing at left guard for them this year. Laken Tomlinson, we've discussed this on the show. I know the numbers last year in New York were not pretty, giving up 7 sacks, more than 50 pressures being a little bit more judgmental in terms of how you dictate whether or not it's a pressure or not. But nonetheless, the subjectivity of it being thrown out. Laken Tomlinson was a Pro Bowler only 2 years ago. But what I really love about this guy is the leadership and how he is taking Charles Cross and Olu Oluwatimi, 2 really young players, under his wing. He's going to be playing next to those 2 guys. And he had revolving doors at center at left tackle in New York last year, which was part of the reason his numbers were so poor, is the supporting cast was not there. If Charles Cross and Olu Oluwatimi can take to his mentorship, which it looks like they're going to, and then you got Scott Huff there who's looking for that veteran leadership, Laken Tomlinson can still play at a very high level. So it isn't just bringing in a leader, it's bringing in a guy that can give you stability in the interior offensive line and maybe be an upgrade over Damian Lewis. If everything plays out the way the Seahawks are hoping it's going to, at minimum, you've got a really nice bridge there at left guard. And the last thing that jumped out to me, maybe I could say this is about the questions that'll be coming up in the third segment, but this is an observation for me just with what Zach Charbonnet looks like right now. And this is not knocking Ken Walker III. I think Ken Walker III is the starter going into this season, but I am very curious and I'm fascinated to see how the running back splits end up going in the regular season, because Zach Charbonnet was one of the players that really stood out to me throughout this offseason program. He looks leaner. He looks a little bit faster and still packs a punch. I know when the pads come on, he's going to be looking to lower that shoulder and deliver some punishment. I cannot wait to see how that goes with those 2 guys. And then maybe Kenny McIntosh and George Halani throwing their helmets in the mix a little bit too. That is going to be a lot of fun to see how that pecking order is established with the talent Seattle has in that running back room.
Yeah, no question about it. I am very excited about the running back position as well. I'm also excited about right tackle. And so when started this conversation, Corbin, we talked about basically the mini camps, the OTAs. I want to go all the way back to late April in the NFL draft in a class that featured as good of a tackle crop as I've ever seen. And I've been evaluating the NFL draft now for basically a quarter of a century at this point. So getting a little
You
bit
old
gray.
man.
Yeah, getting a little bit gray here. And the fact that the Seahawks did not invest an earlier draft pick in a tackle position, of course, Satoa Lauamea and Michael Jarrell were both late day 3 selections, and perhaps they may wind up being involved at the right tackle position. I don't know. But if I do believe that the Seahawks had real concerns about Abraham Lucas, then they would have invested an earlier selection at the right tackle position, a guy that they thought might be able to come in and be a plug and play kind of a factor. The fact that they did not, to me, suggests that the Seahawks do trust that Abraham Lucas is going to be able to be back on the field for them. So unfortunately, we have not been able to see Abraham Lucas actually practicing. He was, of course, on the field with the Seahawks attending the mini camp. But still, going back to the draft, it does suggest the Seahawks feel good about where Abraham Lucas is at. And again, as I mentioned before, at the guard position, if the Seahawks are able to protect Geno Smith, then I do think that based on the talent that he has around him at wide receiver, and as you just mentioned, at the running back position as well, I really do think that Ryan Grubb's offense is not going to just be good in Montlake. It's going to be good in Seattle as well.
When we come back, we're going to continue discussing what we learned this offseason, switching over to the defensive side of the football. Don't go away. You're listening to the Thursday edition of Locked On Seahawks. This episode of Locked On Seahawks is brought your way by Game Time. You shouldn't have to rip your hair out and start looking like me when you buy tickets to your next big event. Game Time is the fast and easy way to buy tickets for all the sports, music, comedy, and theater near you. They've got killer last-minute deals, all-in prices, views from your seat, and their best price guarantee. Game Time takes the guesswork out of buying tickets. Back in March, my mom and I went to the first and second round of the NCAA tournament thanks to Game Time. We were able to see the entire first and second round, all 6 games, for under $450 a piece. That's a really good deal for 6 games of NCAA tournament basketball, and we got it courtesy of Game Time. They've got deals on tickets right up to the day of the event, and Game Time's guarantee means you'll always get the best price to write your own memories. If you find tickets in the same section in a row for less, Game Time will credit you 110% of the difference. So take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use the code LOCKEDON for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem the code LOCKEDON for $20 off. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. You're listening to the Thursday edition of Locked On Seahawks. This is your host, Corbin Smith. Glad to be joined, as always, by my co-host in crime, Rob Rang. And a special thanks to all the 12s out there for making Locked On Seahawks your first listen 5 days a week. We greatly appreciate it. School is out for the summer for the Seahawks. They are done with their spring off-season program after yesterday's second minicamp practice. Mike Macdonald canceling the final practice and letting his players go a day early. Getting some brownie points from the players here as a first-time head coach. We are going to continue diving into what we've learned about this Seahawks team this offseason during the spring program, switching gears now to the defensive side of the football. And I know yesterday, Rob, that we talked a lot about Devin Witherspoon, and how would we not? I mean, Devin Witherspoon is a phenomenal talent, so much fun to watch, an incredibly talented player that is now emerging as a leader for this football team. But it still boils down to just the depth that the Seahawks have at cornerback. It is ridiculous. It almost feels like a fantasy team at corner when you've got guys like Mike Jackson that are playing with the third string defense, and he started 21 games the last 2 years and played at a pretty high level at that.
No, he really did. And that's my point. That's one of the reasons why I really think that, at least for me, one of the biggest takeaways I've had over the offseason, Corbin, has just been the talent and the depth at cornerback for the Seahawks. I thought that was probably the second, third, fourth most gifted squad on this roster, or most gifted positional group on this roster. But I now believe that it is the deepest and most talented positional group on the Seahawks roster at this point. And Devin Witherspoon is a huge part of it. But as you said, we talked about him a lot in yesterday's show. And just to kind of encapsulate it, he's a stud. and he's a stud that has the ability to play primarily inside. And it used to be that nickel corner was basically just kind of a throw-in position. Now it's a starter. You think about all the most dynamic wide receivers in the NFL, so many of them slide into play that slot receiver position. So if you have a nickel corner who not only can cover, but also has the physicality and awareness to be a stud in run support as well, then you really have something. I also have been very encouraged by what I've seen from Greek Woolen. Now, I was among those who was the most lavish in praising him as a rookie, and also among the people who was the most down on him in last year, especially in run support. It's been his awareness in run support that I've been the most intrigued by so far over this offseason. Conversations again with some of the Seahawks scouts and coaches there, and then also just watching it myself. I watched him chew out some of his teammates because they were not being assignment savvy. And that is a different type of a thing. We talked a lot about Devin Witherspoon, but again, seeing that leadership from Greek Woolen is intriguing. Seeing the big play ability still from Trey Brown is certainly intriguing. And then, as you mentioned, with the veteran Mike Jackson, Artie Burns, the two Auburn rookies, Nehemiah Pritchett and DJ James, of course, as well. I just really think that this is one of the absolute best cornerback rooms in all of the NFL. And that's, again, another reason to be very optimistic about the Seahawks moving forward.
Yeah, that cornerback group is just flat out loaded. If they play to their potential, the way we've seen things the last few days, that is a chance to be a scary, good secondary led by that cornerback group. From one first rounder to the next, though, I want to talk Byron Murphy the second, because this was one of the things that clearly jumped out to me from day one. Sometimes, Rob, and you know this from your scouting angle, sometimes you just see a player that first time you see him on the practice field, you're like, okay, I don't even need to know what number the guy is. I don't need to know what his name is. That guy's a first-round pick. And you can see that with Byron Murphy, the ridiculous first step that he has and all the drills. He just looks like he is playing a different game than everybody else in that defense. I mean, I'm talking the veterans even. This guy just looks like he is playing a different game with the way that he moves. And I just enjoy seeing and the incredibly powerful lower body, the ability to play multiple positions, as that's clearly being emphasized for the Seahawks defense under Mike Macdonald. So he has looked every bit like we would expect to be advertised. And going off of yesterday's conversation, you and I were discussing the cautious optimism at linebacker, and we heard several of our listeners kind of, I don't know about this. You're still mentioning names I'm not necessarily comfortable with. Well, this is what my second takeaway here, what I've learned this offseason is, Seahawks fans, you better be ready to expect the unexpected at inside linebacker right now, because Tyrell Dodson, Jerome Baker, already that's who the Seahawks expect to start week one. But Tyrese Knight is coming. I am telling you right now that this rookie wants to play. He's hungry. He's motivated. He's got a long way to go to get there. But at the same time, the improvement we saw from him from start to finish this offseason program, maybe as much as any of these incoming rookies. You've got John Radigan, you got Patrick O'Connell, two players who had really strong mini camps and look like they're going to be ready to compete. So I think when you look at that linebacker spot, yes, the Seahawks have a ton of questions there. And at the same time, I do wonder if expecting the unexpected, it might yield maybe a surprise, a positive surprise for the Seahawks there. So that is something I've learned, is that there's a few guys at this position that maybe, just maybe, we were discounting a little bit, that now we're on the radar a little more as potential guys that can maybe play for the Seahawks on defense at linebacker.
Yeah, no question about it. I mean, the Seahawks linebackers are basically the all-who team at this point, and I still think that you just watch the tape and you just watch how assignment savvy that they are, and the physicality, especially of John Radigan, the speed, especially of O'Connell and Tyrese Knight, and then again, the as an expression I often say, the proof is in the pudding. You just got to go back and watch the tape of Jerome Baker at Miami and Tyrell Dodson in Buffalo, and I do think that the Seahawks fans are going to be pleasantly surprised by how well the Seahawks linebackers play, inside linebackers specifically, play in 2024. But I want to kind of focus in on the defensive line and a couple of players in Leonard Williams and in Draymond Jones that I really think are just uniquely built and talented defensive linemen that, frankly, I didn't think that they produced as much in terms of just numbers, just pure sacks and tackles for loss a year ago that I think that they can produce. They are kind of tweeners in their own way. With Leonard Williams, talking about a guy who's 6'6", 300 pounds. I mean, that's too tall for some as a defensive tackle. And he primarily played at that defensive tackle position for the Seahawks a year ago. Definitely slid outside some in defensive end. But, based on the comments that he gave to the Seahawks media a couple of days ago, Corbin, he is being asked to learn 6 different positions. Yep. And so, again, he is going to be asked to play a variety of different roles. And then when Draymond Jones came out of Ohio State a couple of years ago, part of the reason why he slid in the day 2 of the draft is because he's 6'3", 280 pounds. I mean, that's a tweener if I've ever seen one along the defensive line. So help move him outside to outside linebacker, allow him to use his burst and then slide inside and obvious pass rush opportunities inside of the defense tackle. I just think that you're allowing the more unique athletes that the Seahawks have, and Byron Murphy is definitely part of that conversation as well, but feature their uniqueness rather than allow them to basically be kind of those tweener players that aren't able to be productive. So that's going to kind of tie into my final takeaway here, where I've been very impressed with Mike Macdonald, Adam Durde, and the rest of the Seahawks defensive coaches so far, is that the creativity that we saw with the Baltimore Ravens a year ago did not end in Baltimore. Mike Macdonald has absolutely brought that. And I think that he's got the skill position talent on defense really to be able to take advantage of that. We kind of talked about it's almost like an amoeba defense. You don't know who is coming and who is dropping back, some zone blitz wrinkles and things like that. It's not just the X's and O's on a whiteboard. The Seahawks actually have the versatile athletes, as I just mentioned, that you may actually be able to get home and take advantage of Mike Macdonald's creativity.
Yeah, that's a big thing with this defense. When you're trying to be able to disrupt opposing offenses with confusion and not knowing what you're going to be doing out there. In order to do that, you got to have a bunch of chess pieces at all 3 levels that you can move around in order to be able to make those disguises happen. And the Seahawks luckily have the players on the defensive line in the secondary to be able to do those things and mix and match players. And in particular, that cornerback group. And this kind of going off what you mentioned earlier, just the depth. This is the last thing that I learned here. If John Schneider is going to be making any deals at the end of training camp, as he's done several times in the past to try to shore up a position, maybe it's inside linebacker, who knows, that cornerback group, that is where the trade chips lie right now. They've got some guys there that could absolutely start for a number of teams in the NFL that are second and third stringers in that cornerback group. That may be where that value is, that you can get somebody to fill a big gap in another position, the cornerback spot. We'll have to wait and see, but that is clearly the position right now to me that John Schneider's got the most trade chips that he can work with at the NFL trade poker table. When we come back, now that the offseason's wrapped up, not every question's been answered heading towards training camp. Rob and I are going to be discussing a few questions that each of us still have heading into this 6-week hiatus before the Seahawks report for the start of training camp. Don't go away. You're listening to the Thursday edition of Locked On Seahawks. You're listening to the Thursday episode of Locked On Seahawks. I'm your host, Corbin Smith. Glad to be joined, as always, by my co-host in crime, Rob Rang. And a special thanks to each and every one of the 12s out there. Thank you for making Locked On Seahawks your first listen 5 days a week. We greatly appreciate it. The offseason program officially over for the Seahawks. The first program under new coach Mike Macdonald. School's out for the summer. We'll see him again in late July when they report for the start of training camp. Obviously, not every question that we had going into OTAs has just magically been answered, and there may be some new ones that have ended up popping up here the last couple of weeks going towards training camp. So, Rob, let's get to it. The questions that are still lingering for you and I as we head towards the start of training camp. What's the big question that jumps out to you first that still hasn't been necessarily answered here in recent weeks?
Well, I still think you have to focus in at the inside linebacker position. Now, I just got done talking about how I am cautiously optimistic about what the Seahawks have at inside linebacker, but still, I certainly believe that it's going to be Tyrell Dodson and Jerome Baker who are going to be Seattle's primary starters this season. Now, whether that happens in week 1 against the Denver Broncos, of course, remains to be seen with both of these players coming off of injuries. And the reality is that while I'm excited about the physicality and the instincts that John Radigan has shown and the athletic ability again from Patrick O'Connell and Tyrese Knight in particular, none of them have more than 15 tackles at the NFL level. And so that certainly remains a huge area of concern, especially given the fact that part of the allure of Mike Macdonald coming to Seattle is that he was basically believed to be this linebacker guru. And so when you lose a player like a Bobby Wagner and certainly a Jordan Brooks as well, and you bring in a couple of guys that people aren't familiar with, then that is going to be an overwhelming concern. And especially when you consider the dynamic running backs and quarterbacks in some cases that the Seahawks are going to be facing here, just even in the division here. You know that Sean McVay and Kyle Shanahan in particular are just kind of licking their lips at the opportunities to be able to kind of pick on this young, inexperienced linebacking core. And so that to me is the one position group at this point who I do think could absolutely sink Mike Macdonald's defense in the first year. I do have more optimism than I had a couple of months back, but I still think that this is the number one position of concern for the Seahawks.
And I'm going to go on the same tangent just on the offensive side of the football, the one position that could really sink Ryan Grubb's offense. And that's right guard. I'm with you that I think that this group has shown that there's more there than we expected going into the start of the offseason program. There's still plenty of excitement about Christian Haynes. Anthony Bradford started 10 games last year. McLennan Curtis has been a player that's been intriguing, and you watch that guy rock a blocking sled. There's another player that just looks a little bit different than everybody else with those really long arms and just whacking that sled. I want to see if he can do that against defenders, because if he can, then that makes things interesting. So the big question for me isn't necessarily about the talent at guard or the potential at guard. It's who's going to stand out in that group, who's going to win the job, because that now is truly a question mark for me. I went into OTAs, and maybe Christian Haynes is still going to end up being the guy. I made the prediction a few weeks ago that Christian Haynes was starting week 1. I'm starting to wonder about whether or not I want to stick with that prediction, because I think he's still got a very bright future. But at the same time, McLennan Curtis has opened my eyes a little bit. He was one of the big winners in this offseason program, and he's only in year 2. It's not like this is a 28-year-old journeyman. He is a young player, too, who played in the Senior Bowl 2 years ago. There's a lot to like about McLennan Curtis. And Anthony Bradford, we'd be remiss not to mention him with some of the good film that we got from last year. It was a very up and down rookie year, but he's a real physical mauler that brings that toughness they're looking for up front. You got 3 different style players that all bring something a little different. But the big question to me is who is going to rise up and actually take that position? Because at this point, I'm not necessarily sure that I know who's going to win it. And I think all 3 of those guys are very much in the thick of that competition. On the defensive side of the football, another question that I've got going towards training camp isn't about who's on the roster, but who could potentially be on the roster once we get to training camp. And this is on the heels of Draymond Jones having his contract restructured. That was announced today that the Seahawks opened more than $7.5 million in cap space. Now, that might be John Schneider doing his typical bookkeeping where, hey, I just want a little flexibility before the trade deadline. Let's go into the year with $7 or $8 million. But it could also mean, you know what, I got a free agent that I want, or there's a player that might be available via trade, an inside linebacker maybe, that I can go out and get that I needed a little more cap space to get. So that's a question for me. Is there an impact player that isn't on this roster yet that could be when we get to the start of training camp because of that move to restructure Draymond Jones's contract? That creates a lot of intrigue for me.
No, it certainly does for me as well. I would argue, we talked about this before, inside linebacker and safety, there's still an awful lot of big names out there. Obviously, everybody, all the Seahawks fans out there could be mentioned: Quandre Diggs, Jamal Adams, Justin Simmons from the Broncos is an all-pro as well. And so there's some really good linebackers and safeties that are available out there. And as you mentioned, via trade also. I want to go back to a really good point I thought that you made before about what a huge addition Laken Tomlinson could be. And that, when you look at the analytic websites and they were so critical of Tomlinson, and you made I think the very astute observation about just the lack of, just consistency around him, whether it be a quarterback, whether it be an offensive tackle, the left tackle position, or at the center position for the New York Jets a year ago. It really put Laken Tomlinson in a difficult position. I would argue that right tackle remains an area of concern for the Seahawks. And all those who are concerned about, say, Anthony Bradford at right guard, I wonder what would have been the case if he had a little bit more consistency at center, who, of course, Evan Brown was the primary starter a year ago. Right tackle was basically shuffling because of Abraham Lucas's struggles with durability a year ago. If Anthony Bradford would be viewed as a little bit more of a reliable factor at right guard, if he had a little bit more consistency, especially at right tackle. So, again, as I just got done saying how I am encouraged by the fact that the Seahawks did not draft a right tackle early on, it is still a gamble because Abraham Lucas, of course, the Seahawks were counting on him a year ago. And the fact that Abraham Lucas went down and struggled with injuries as much as he did, to me, that is one of the biggest reasons why the Seahawks, in a lot of people's opinion, certainly in mine, that they, did not meet expectations a year ago. And so just like I mentioned before about inside linebacker, right tackle specifically, not so much guard for me, right tackle specifically is the one position I think that could basically be the hole in the ship that could sink the Seahawks before they ever got to harbor.
The last question that I've got going into training camp that I don't feel like I've got anywhere close to a clear answer on over the last few weeks, it goes to the special teams aspect, the new kick return rules. How much weight is the kick return rule going to play in who ends up winning a roster spot at receiver? That to me is one of the huge question marks for this team, just from the sense that you got to see how much this new kickoff is going to impact games, and nobody knows at this point. There's a lot of uncertainty there. Do you want to put a roster spot or dedicated roster spot to somebody like a D. Eskridge, who you feel like he is our best kick returner on our team, but he might be our 7th or 8th best receiver at this point? Can you justify keeping him on the team at kick return? Or do you try to figure out, hey, are we going to take a 2nd or 3rd best player at that kick return position that might be offering more to us on other special teams or offer more to us on offense? And that might be where Derek Young fits in the equation, Laviska Shenault, maybe Hayden Hatton. So I think that is maybe one of the biggest question marks that I still have, is just how much weight that return position is going to carry in terms of roster construction, particularly at the receiver position. How much is that going to help D. Eskridge at this point? How much is going to help Laviska Shenault? Or maybe somebody like a Kenny McIntosh is going to jump in and say, hey, I want to be their kick returner. And then suddenly the receiver position, there isn't as much bearing on that kick return competition. So there are a lot of question marks there relating special teams to receiver depth for the Seahawks that remain unanswered.
Well, and not just a kick returner, but a punt returner as well. As I mentioned before in yesterday's show, I believe it was, I was impressed by what I saw from D. Eskridge in terms of returning, just fielding balls that, despite the huge wins that were an issue for everybody basically during Tuesday's practice. I do think that is a fascinating one, and that's one that would have been very high on my list as well. And you hinted at one of my final questions about the Seahawks, and this is not a negative one. This is a very much a positive one, but it's at the running back position. I think that there is a possibility that Zach Charbonnet is going to really challenge Kenneth Walker III. And like you, I expect K9 to be Seattle's starter. I think that he has a dynamic elusiveness to him that very few running backs in any part of the NFL can match what he can do. But there is some inconsistency to his game. There are times where it looks like he is unwilling to get the 2 or 3 yard gain. because he's looking for the 20 or 30-yard gain. And Zach Charbonnet hits the hole with a different level of just sheer physicality and determination, in my opinion. I mean, he just attacks the hole. At least that's what I've seen so far in the during these mini camps. And so I'm really excited about what Zach Charbonnet has been able to show. You said it. I mean, he looks faster. He looks sleeker. He looks just like he has dropped a little bit of the weight that maybe and a little bit of the hesitation that might have just been because he was a rookie. So I really do think that the Seahawks, for the first time in a while now, are truly going to have a two-headed approach at the running back position, and maybe even a 3 or 4-headed approach at the running back position. And that should make their offense that much more dynamic.
Yeah, as I mentioned earlier, that's going to be something that I'm watching closely when we get into training camp, just because I want to see how those reps get split up, how Charbonnet fits into this offense. He has a more similar skill set to Dylan Johnson, the running back for Washington last year. So I don't know how much that plays into things. Washington didn't have a Ken Walker III in the backfield either. Didn't have a player like that. So there's a lot of moving parts there, but I think it creates a lot of intrigue. As always, you can follow me on X and Threads at Corbin Smith NFL. You can follow Rob at Rob Rang. Make sure to subscribe to Locked On Seahawks on YouTube and wherever you listen to your podcast to make sure you don't miss a single episode. Come out tomorrow. It's Blue Friday. Nick Lee and I will be dishing out our winners and losers, our stock watch coming out of the offseason program. Who has momentum going to training camp, and which players are going to need to turn the Jets on when they report in late July. We're breaking it all down. Make sure you're listening in and enjoy the rest of your Thursday. Thanks for listening. Go Hawks.